In this session, we'll speak to Sam, who is the Chief Communications Officer for the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative, the ATII. The ATII is a non-profit organisation that works in partnership to combat human trafficking. What was really clear speaking to Sam is the passion and motivation that comes across from individuals working in this area. We really hear about the human element of human trafficking that is so often forgotten when we're dealing with compliance functions. We'll hear from Sam about a range of opportunities that exist within the ATII for compliance professionals and wider professionals to volunteer their time to fight human trafficking.
Sam, firstly, thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
Absolutely.
Here we're going to speak about your role with the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative as part of our series looking at different compliance roles. And with yourself working in the non-profit sector, it's really it's very different compared to some of our other career paths in compliance that are more financial intelligence based.
Sure.
So I think to start off, could you describe your role and the work of the ATII?
You got it. Yes, well, I'm the Chief Communications Officer, and what that basically means is I get to cultivate relationships for a living, and I love it. Currently, we are a startup. ATII was started by Aaron Kaler, who is an expert in the financial field, and as he was working through some fraud investigations and anti-money laundering investigations, he started realizing that there's a massive gap when it comes to human trafficking. And human trafficking is essentially on par with terrorist financing and all sorts of other aspects that we really focus on from a financial side, but we weren't focusing on what he was really just being called to is the humanity of it all. So ATII was born almost a year ago. We're coming up on a year. Aaron and I had a conversation. He mentioned to me that he was looking to start this nonprofit, and it was all about anti-human trafficking, but following the money. And I was like, sign me up. That's it. That sounds great, because we're not really looking at this from the financial aspect as a whole. You know, everyone knows there's a financial transaction, but are we really making a dent as far as following the money and really trailing it out? And so that is how ATII came about, and it has evolved beautifully in this not quite a year thus far. Yeah.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear. I mean, I know a lot of our listeners have heard about the ATII through the website, through LinkedIn. It definitely comes up in a lot of conversations here. You mentioned the concept of following the money. So a lot of our students work in financial institutions.
Okay.
Could you describe the role of financial intelligence in countering human trafficking?
Yes, well, it's very broad, because if you look at human trafficking, there are different aspects of that. You know, there's organ trafficking, which does not get a lot of press, so to speak. People don't talk about that often, but there's a financial or a value exchange in that. So there's a money trail to follow along that path. There's also the labor trafficking, and labor trafficking can come in a multitude of facets. It looks like, you know, like this in some countries, and it looks like that in other countries. There's the supply chain. So you want to follow the money through the supply chain. You know, we have a product, let's say this pencil, you know, where did it come from and what all went into creating this? So that is a money trail to follow, so to speak, as well. And then you look at more the sex trafficking, and sex trafficking has a multitude of ways that it comes about in the world. There can be online only, online exploitation, can be person-to-person exploitation. So in following the money, it's really important to understand the indicators, the red flags. It's important to understand what human trafficking even is, because as much press as it's getting lately, which I'm thankful for, because it's no longer as in the dark, but my goodness, Ian, there are so many myths going on and not correct or incorrect information being spewed around that somewhat it kind of muddies the waters. So I think it's important to get your education from, number one, people who know what they're talking about and have seen it, and number two, from accredited organizations that have a consistent curriculum, a curriculum that builds upon the modules before. like for our clients and our sponsors, which are the people we work with in the banking and financial institution areas, we provide an e-learning platform. That e-learning platform takes them from A to Z. What is trafficking? What does it look like from person to person? And what does it look like on a ledger? What does it look like on the back end of like, wow, that's just, it's not looking right. Another part that we are always talking, and especially me, I tell people, follow your gut. Trust your gut. If something does not seem right, it probably isn't. So that's kind of a little bit of the breadth there. We also do a lot of training in data, how to look at the data, what to do with that data, how to put it together into a report or a picture that makes sense. Because you can have all the data in the world, but if you don't know what to do with that, it's sort of useless.
That's a lot of really key points you've just mentioned there. And if I can take us back to the point about education.
Yes.
So my follow-on question was going to be, how can financial crime professionals detect human trafficking? And
Sure.
I think from your previous answer and from my experience, from my own experience in human trafficking, it's a very broad church. That there's a lot of different types, and I suppose it's very difficult to say here are definitive indicators.
Mm-hmm.
In spite of that, are there any key indicators or red flags which are common across a range of different types of human trafficking?
Yeah, if let's kind of unpack, let's say domestic sex trafficking. So what we might see if there's a person who is trafficking, let's say one or two women or boys or girls, men or women, one of the myths is that it's always girls and et cetera, different ages. Anyone can be trafficked. If we're looking at domestic sex trafficking, some of the indicators might be, someone for a bank, you always want to know your customer. You want to know background when someone opens an account. They ask you all the questions. What are you doing? What's the business account for? What kind of what amount of funds are you expecting to go in and out? Do you need a debit card? All those basic questions. But you want to see, you want to use your mind of, okay, now this is that particular business, and then when they set up their account, they said they were going to be doing X, Y, Z. Yet now we see that they're putting deposits in late at night, or they're putting a large chunk of change in and then taking it right out. Or there are no, like if it's a personal bank account, there are no personal expenses. Like we all have basic expenses that, you got to pay the rent, got to pay the electric, some basic utilities, maybe some food, but you don't see that. That's a little bit of a red flag. None of the red flags or indicators are in and of themselves like a yes, ma'am, we're right on, we're right onto something bad here. But it's usually if they come in like a collective of these indicators. We've put together what we call a BOLO, so a be on the lookout. We have one for financial institutions and then one for just the general public. So I'd be happy to forward that to you. Any of your listeners can have it. It's a PDF. So if you'd like, you're welcome to just attach that in the show notes or something. And then we're also working on one a little more in depth for the actual financial investigators, the cryptocurrency forums, the people that are really watching all these digital transactions going by.
That's really interesting. I would really appreciate a copy of that document. Yeah. I know a lot of our colleagues in compliance and a lot of the students taking these courses are really interested in the education side, in developing. Sure. And even to go into our next question kind of quite nicely is we've seen with the work of the ATII, there's a lot of opportunities for volunteers. So a lot of financial crime professionals have volunteered their time and energy with your nonprofit. What type of opportunities exist in the ATII which those watching the show could be interested in?
Yeah, well, I'm happy you asked because I am the chief expertise wrangler, as I call myself. I get to vet everybody, have conversations with everyone. We have an extensive onboarding and training system because it's as important to me as kind of a person helping someone find their way. I want to make sure that they are doing something that they enjoy or that they feel like they'll be adding value, but I also want to make sure they're getting something from volunteering with us. Whether it be expanding their network, whether it be learning a new skill, refining a new skill. We've got mentors on board who are very experienced. We've got new guys and gals that are just getting their feet wet in the idea of looking into cyber crimes. We have people who are survivors of human trafficking that volunteer with us. And I find that everybody that I've worked with thus far, and I think we have about 50 to 55 experteers, which is what we call them. They're experts and volunteers. No matter if they're just in the just financial, if they're law enforcement, we've got a few retired law enforcement officers with us. And like I mentioned, we have a few survivors who just really love the concept of following the money. And so we've got them. We've got people like myself who come to this through just some personal situations at home, in my own home, that kind of led me to learning about human trafficking. And it became one of those things that once I knew about it and once I learned all the intricacies, I couldn't not do anything about it, if that makes sense. It became one of those, like, you can't unsee certain things and you can't unlearn certain things. And if you're like me, one of those people that's like, well, I got to do something about it. So we have a few volunteers like that. We've got writers that help with the blog, which is great. I just onboarded a gentleman who's going to help me with the podcast, like what you're doing. Because as great as I am at meeting people and talking, and we can create great content, when it comes to editing and putting all this stuff together, not my wheelhouse. So I was so happy that this guy came along to help with the editing. So we've got a good group of people. It's amazing.
That sounds really great, and I know exactly what you mean about the podcasting. Yeah. It's not as easy as it looks, that's for sure. It really sounds as if the ATI has a wide range of individual partnerships and individual contributors. Yeah. You mentioned earlier on about partnerships being really the key of the ATI. What kind of industry partnerships has the ATII established or looking to establish?
Sure. Well, if you look at our website, so any of y'all that are watching, please look at our website, which is followmoneyfights.org. You'll see a list of all our current sponsors and partners. We call them strategic partnerships because that's essentially what they are. I like to kind of call it like a crowdsourcing, so to speak, of corporations. And some of them would even be in competition with each other out in the quote unquote real corporate world. But when it comes to banding together to collaborate and fight trafficking, all of these men and women are on board. And that's part of, I think, a gift that both Erin and I have. It's that ability to help people see the bigger picture, help them see where they fit in, and then help them see that by banding together with other people that are working towards the same mission, you're much stronger. We're much more of a force to push back against the bad guys, because I'll tell you, those guys are organized. Those guys work together. Not all the time. Sometimes there's just your individual rogue people, but the good guys cannot continue to be working against each other by not collaborating. Because you might as well be working against each other if you're not working together in this field. Because I literally feel that human trafficking should be the one uniting force for this whole world. Like, why wouldn't everyone want to work together to get rid of it? I just can't think of anything else. And honestly, part of my mama bear comes out, and I don't accept anything less. If people get all competitive and, I want credit, I kind of look at them like, there is no such thing as credit here. Who gives a rip? We want to be doing the right thing. Let's work together. The credit, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
That's so true. That really is so true. And I really appreciate when I look at the work of the ATII and see how there is that diverse range of individuals and strategic partners that come into the mix. Mm-hmm. Because as you say, it shouldn't be a competitive space. So when we have all these component parts coming into the ATII, we have the individual contributors, we have the strategic partners, we have the education piece. Could you describe a success story or a piece of work which the ATI has done that's really showcased its skills?
Sure. Obviously, I can't give real specifics. It's kind of one of those I could tell you, but I have to kill you thing. But no, I don't want to tell you. We work in a few different segments of the financial sector right now to help those that are doing investigations. So we have some arrangements with folks who are doing more of the behind the scenes, trying to gather the information and evidence. So what we're able to do is apply our data set, which we call a high risk human trafficking data set, to see if some of these folks are on the radar, you know, help investigators do their jobs better. So what we're finding is, again, we are a startup, so we're just out there kind of exploring where we're going to fit in best. But we are discovering that when we collaborate our data set and our skill set with some of the corporate tools and tactics that are going on in the investigations realm, we're being able to help them speed up investigations, which is huge. Because I always think, you know, the longer that someone is being victimized, because we're trying to get our collective act together, the more that person is traumatized. So to me, it's always a sense of urgency. And I tell people, like, we don't have till Monday. I don't care what you need to do to make this happen right now. Because I often look at these investigations and I see, you know, it started in August of 2016 and here it is, you know, 2020, and we finally have enough evidence. And I'm thinking, how in the world how is that the reality? So our goal is to expedite, help with the evidence, help make sure that we don't have to re-traumatize the victim or the survivor, because that's the sad part of investigations and prosecutions, is in a typical courtroom setting, the victim has to testify. The victim has to go through and tell an entire room of strangers or a computer and have it recorded, all the horrific things that happen to them, no matter what the type of trafficking it is. Because I'll tell you, labor trafficking is just as horrific to that human as sex trafficking is. So we have those multiple facets that really help speed up the investigations. So that would be the way I would kind of describe it. You know, we have our more behind the scenes aspect that I don't talk about publicly, because it's kind of the stuff that needs to stay more between the people that are doing the investigations.
Absolutely.
And I'm happy to have a conversation in private with anyone. We do, you know, we sign a non-disclosure agreement to make sure that anything people tell me or I tell them is copacetic. Same with all of our team. But, you know, when it comes to investigations for the financial institutions, we really think that the better you can be at knowing your customer and knowing what human trafficking potentially looks like, the better your company will not be laundering their money for them. I mean, how about that? That's a crazy one. Here you are helping them finance their illicit activities when banks don't know about it.
Absolutely. I mean, in that example, I really appreciated the human aspect that you were
Oh yes.
that came across in your answer, because
Yeah.
coming from law enforcement myself and having been in that role, and then obviously moving into a compliance space, it's something which I always see is lacking from a lot of compliance and financial crime professionals, is the human aspect.
It is.
I mean, it's relatively easy, I think, to spot money laundering indicators, but it's very hard sometimes to remember the person or the victim behind those transactions. My next question, and I'm not sure we'll ever have enough time to answer this because there's so many things to unpack, but if there was one thing which you would like financial crime professionals to know about human trafficking or the fight against human trafficking, what would that be?
I think if we're looking at specifically those who are in the financial field, let's say we're a teller. We'll go from the teller to the fraud department, and you know, we can do a couple examples. But the teller, if you're seeing someone physically in front of you creating a transaction, you know, obviously most banking people are friendly and they're engaging, but check in with the person, make sure things look normal. You know, are people nervous? Are you seeing someone else in the bank with them that is kind of controlling the situation? You know, be alert. And those are some of the things I talk about in that bolo that I'll send over to you. Now that, and then if you're concerned about something, put a little note in the account. I mean, that doesn't hurt anything to say, something just didn't seem right here, or put a note to look into it a little bit deeper later if you're really busy. Don't take for granted the fact that sometimes these signs are all around us, but we're just not paying attention. We're too busy doing our job. And that's something that when I've spoken with survivors, they say to me, I wish someone would have noticed, and it's like, that's heartbreaking. Heartbreaking when you're looking at someone and they don't even notice you're traumatized. Not okay. We have jobs to do, yes, but we're also humans. We're also people. We're also souls. We also, we connect that way. Now, as far as the fraud and people that are looking at potential indicators, you know as well as probably most of your listeners that there are the suspicious activity reports, or whatever they're called, where your listeners are listening from. So if something's suspicious, fill out one of those reports. And when you do, you don't have to know exactly if it's human trafficking or potential drug trafficking or whatever the indicators are. Just trust that gut again and write down everything that you noticed. If it's something physical, if it's an interaction between the potential person who's being trafficked and a potential exploiter, write that down too. Write down what you notice as far as the way they're dressed, the way they speak. Did they have their identification on them? Did they not? The more clear you can be, the better, because honestly, at first, it just seems to kind of go into a file somewhere. But then when law enforcement is doing their due diligence and gathering their evidence, if there's a suspicious report on file and it has details, it's clear, that helps them immensely when it comes down to the point of looking to prosecute. But if there is no paper trail, so to speak, or digital trail, their hands are kind of tied. So if you notice things, just write it down and talk to your boss. Number one, lobby for education, even if it's just something as simple as a human trafficking 101 course, which we have plenty that I can refer people to, or if their institution is interested in really making anti-human trafficking one of those platforms upon which they stand, we have an entire suite of education. We have, and then people have access to us and our levels of expertise to run things by, to really be able to help them in their investigations and make sure those get into the right hands. Because I think nothing's sadder than to look back and know that maybe you could have intervened, but you were too busy doing your job, or you just didn't know, and ignorance is no longer a real valid answer, because there's so much information out there. We just have to put it to work. I think that's how I would kind of wrap that up. But again, there's so many different layers, and man, I mean, we get into cryptocurrency, and we got some good stuff to share with our people. So that's for sure.
For sure. I think from your answer, I think there's three things I take away from that: is the role of education, the role of details in suspicious transaction reports, suspicious activity reports, depending on our jurisdiction, and also the human intuition. So it's frontline staff.
Yes.
Absolutely. Now, switching gears slightly, I've asked these questions of all the interviewees because I'm always interested how people came into this field, how people ended up working in a financial crime or a compliance role. Because I'm always surprised how many people made a career change or came from a vastly different background. So on a more personal note, could you tell me about your journey into working with the ATII?
Sure. Well, this is a complete 180 for me personally. I'm a chiropractor by trade. I was trained in the mid 90s, and I was up in the Northwest, did all my training there, went back to Arizona. That's where I'm mainly from. I was in practice for many years there, and an opportunity came up in Florida, so moved over to Florida. And I have kids and all that good stuff. Life's rolling along. Have my practices, everything's great. And then I just started to kind of get that sense of I'm ready for something different, because practice changed. All the insurance, everything changed. So I was kind of already in that question mode. And then what kind of abruptly helped me turn into more of the human trafficking aspect, I had my eldest daughter ran away. It was a tremendously horrific thing. It was frightening, all of those things. I don't get into details because it's her story to tell. But as I learned, when I mentioned earlier, is once you learn about the risks that people face out there, especially runaways, kids who may have been groomed by somebody who meant them ill. And grooming is a whole other topic. I mean, if you ever want to get into that, it's not necessarily the financial side, but there does become a financial component to that. But I learned more than I ever wanted to know about the risks that our young people are in just by being online, trying to fit in, trying to have friends, trying to find their way in the world. And there are really horrible human beings out there. It's hard sometimes for me to call them human because I don't think it's natural for a human to prey on another human. That is a very odd part of our makeup. And I'm a very protective person. I'm often likened to a mama bear because I will definitely protect all my cubs, and I'm definitely not someone that someone wants to come up against if they're trying to hurt people. So that protective nature really came out after I got my family as healed as we could from a terrible situation. And you never really truly heal, but I think you get to a point where you realize, okay, that happened. And now I've got this entirely new set of skills because I was actively involved in finding her. And I mean, we worked with 3-letter agencies, we worked with local police departments, we worked with search and rescue people to find my kid. That was a skill set I never would have wanted to acquire, but then once I did, I couldn't just put it on the shelf. It became one of those things. It was an obsession. It was almost like a drive that was so deep because then other people are out there hurting, and we can't just turn our backs. So a few years went by, and I would help local people find their kids, and or at least find the right resources if I couldn't help in my own local area. Did a lot of work trying to help families heal and get the right resources to do so, while trying to figure my own self out. So then one day I had a conversation with a friend of a friend, and that's Erin Kaler, is the friend of a friend. And we just decided that it was time for us, for us, it was the right chemistry, the right skill sets to come together and really get this nonprofit off the ground. And then we kind of naturally, like over the years, I've had my own businesses. So, I have all the skills from CEO to, chief administration officer, whatever it may be, because I've done all that. But really my skill set, because I'm not the financial expert, my skill set came in best to be the chief communications officer and really help foster those relationships that are necessary in a very complex field like this. So it really, for me, that the change just was, I couldn't not do this. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It really does. Yeah. It really does. And
yeah, it's one of those, like, you just can't not. I don't know how else to answer it.
It really comes through very clear, your passion for this work and how your story has led to working with Aaron and forming the ATII, which I'm sure I'll mispronounce at some point, but
I do all the time. It's a long word, long name.
I think it's very impressive taking your personal experience and expanding it into this non-profit. A lot of people, a lot of compliance colleagues talk about wanting to do something much bigger than themselves, but yes, it's always that stumbling block in turning ideas into action. Now, yes, having gone through that process into forming the ATII, I suppose upon reflection, what lessons did you learn about moving into this field, but also in forming this nonprofit?
Mm-hmm. Whew, how much time we have? I have learned a lot of lessons, but I think one of the things I tie back to is part of my work when I was in chiropractic and nutrition and wellness. I became a life coach, and that's just part of the healing process and me contributing to helping people heal themselves, because I was always very clear with my clients, like, look, I'm not doing the healing, because they're like, oh, doc, you're great, you, all this stuff. I'm like, no. I don't take any credit because the credit is within your body. This is the way things naturally flow. If you get rid of the resistance, feed the body what it needs, et cetera, et cetera. So part of that, I became a life coach, and I've always talked with my clients about establishing habits that are good for them, that make them feel like they're really being fed by their life, not just existing. So when I look at that, it's kind of like taking, this experience. Yes, it was not good. There were some good aspects. I learned that people do care, and people can band together when there's something that's really pressing and urgent. The most important lessons I've learned is that it's very important to do something that is just, it just consumes you, in a positive way. I've always tried to live my life where I'm going more towards something versus away. So like in health, I would always be moving towards health versus trying to fight disease. So in this case, what I try to do as with ATII is help with that collaboration, help people understand where they can work together, and where, again, by working together, their synergy is so much stronger than working individually. So it became more of that. I've coached people so naturally my whole life. I've been an athlete my whole life too. So to me, it's just connecting people is completely natural. The reason I stopped practicing is because I fell out of love with it. It became not just a job, it became something that it was hard to contribute to somebody's healing when my energy wasn't good. So by having that experience, I really understood that it's possible to do that. You can still like your job and be doing well and making whatever money you need to be making, but if you're really not connected to it, it's an empty source. And I think we're on the planet to live into our strengths and our gifts. And then I also parlay this over to working with survivors when I have the opportunity to talk with them. It's like, okay, this did happen to you. It's time now to really dive into who you are. Let's start defining you instead of defining everything that is based on the past. And then one of the things I'm working on, just on a more personal note with my coaching, is I have programs that I created for businesses and business owners and executives that I'm now kind of retrofitting to help work with I call them at promise youth versus at risk youth. But those youth that they don't have many options. Maybe they don't have somebody helping encourage them to go to college. Maybe they are in one of the risk zones in our communities that, trafficking is heavy in some areas, and it's because there are no other alternatives. So I want to help feed those alternatives instead of just try to catch them on the way out. Like I feel if we can prevent anyone from ever being trafficked, that's the hugest win. Same with disease. Like, let's prevent the disease instead of having this whiz-bang treatment. Man, I'll tell you, looking in the eyes of people who've been trafficked, you don't really heal. I mean, you heal, and you move on, but there's something there that is with them forever. And if we can prevent that, sign me up all day, every day.
Yes,
So it's
definitely a field which evokes a lot of emotion, a lot of
Sure.
motivation. I think that's really important, as you say, in any line of work that you do, is to have that drive, that passion, that motivation. If I'm to flip that question around on its head, and rather than give some lessons into how you formed a nonprofit, if you had someone who was considering launching themselves into a career in the anti-human trafficking space, what advice would you give to them as a starting point?
Okay, this I have definitely thought about before, because I think it's one of those conversations I want to start on LinkedIn pretty soon. I am all for individualism. Again, I'm as independent as I come, almost all, ask some of my friends. But part of that individualism is great in certain aspects. So instead of starting another nonprofit or a new thing, or trying to come in and be new on the scene, look at the nonprofits that are already out there and try to figure where you can fit in, because I will tell you this, the paperwork and the red tape and trying to figure out all the rigmarole for doing another nonprofit, it's a lot of work. And it's almost like, let's say you're a great baker and everyone's like, oh, you should make these pies, you should go into business for yourself. And you're like, yeah, I totally should. So you get all the money together, you buy your baking stuff, you buy your baking, your ovens and everything. And then eventually you realize you have no money. You've spent all your time on trying to make this business work, and you've fallen out of love with the very thing that used to drive you and light you up. So as far as starting a new nonprofit, I would really consider, why do I want to do that? What is it about this particular field that really lights me up? And then talk to people who are already doing those things, because chances are they would probably love to have you come on board with them. Because I'll tell you this, the first year, 2, 3, 5, you're probably not going to make much of an income. And you're going to have all that back office stuff to work on. And chances are, if you're wanting to get into this field specifically, you just want to help people. You just want to be contributing to something bigger than yourself. And it is a whole lot more streamlined process to just go and do that for someone who's already doing it successfully. I personally, unless someone is just like, they come from a background of business or certain types of business, they're well funded. Yeah, maybe you look at starting your own nonprofit, but man, I wouldn't recommend it. And that's just my honest 100% answer. Yeah. I would not start a new one.
That's a
great one and done.
That's a great point, because I think we have a lot of duplication of effort as well.
I mean, so much. And that brings that competition, which, believe it or not, there is a cutthroat world in the nonprofit space. And that breaks my heart. First few times I was literally crushed, like, what do you mean people are competing with each other in the nonprofit world? So that was a whole eye-opening experience. So again, if people can collaborate and create a synergy that makes everything bigger, better, more attractive to funding, that's the way I would go. And that's what we are doing. I mean, that's why we're staying lean and mean, and we're connecting and collaborating with other people. It just makes more sense.
That's a theme which has gone throughout this interview is collaboration and partnership. It wouldn't be 2020 if I didn't ask about COVID-19 and the impact both on the ATII, but also with regards to human trafficking as well.
Sure. Okay, well, I'll start with the ATII side. As COVID was coming into our world, we had just been getting a little momentum. We had just been kind of, coming on the scene. We had some really great conversations with potential banking partners, and then COVID hit and everyone decided to make no more decisions for at least, 3, 4, 5 months now. So it kind of put a halt. But what it did as well, though, is some people had more free time. So they were able to volunteer a little bit more. It did afford us the opportunity to, people were home more. They had less of that travel time. They were online. They were already doing Zoom. So some of those collaborations, it eased them. Some came to a total dead halt, but we're starting to kind of get those wheels turning again. So that's kind of how COVID affected us. Now, as far as COVID overall on human trafficking, that's a really broad the answer, and I would never want to say that I'm an expert on that, but what I've seen and what I've heard, some folks say in the in-person trafficking, like a trafficking, no way to really measure that, but we have seen through some of our partners, we have seen that the online sexual exploitation, predominantly of minors, has increased quite a bit. So that's kind of the challenge, but it has been effective.
Yeah, it just goes to show, even though we have COVID-19 throughout the world, this type of activity still continues. The point you made about people having more free time, that's one of those silver linings of
Yeah.
this whole COVID experience is people have time to explore some of the interests and opportunities which we don't always have time to do. If as a closing comment, if someone watching this has been inspired by the work of the ATII and wants to become more involved, how would they go about doing that?
That's a wonderful question, and we are always looking for people that want to contribute in some way, shape, or form. We have a pretty streamlined process on our website, which is followmoneyfightslavery.org. You'll see a little teal-colored, turquoise-colored button that says volunteer. You click on that, add in your name, your first and last name, and your email, and then our system automatically sends an email that gives a little background on what we're doing. A bit about what we're up to, talks about our mission and our vision, and then asks that person some pertinent questions like, who are you? What do you want to get out of this? What do you feel you could contribute? What drives you in life? How much time might you have to devote to a project? And then they send that all to me, and then we sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then we have a conversation. And I'm really keen on these non-disclosure agreements because I think it's important for people to be able to speak freely, and knowing that people have basically, done the spit agreement, like we're not, what you tell me is my information from you directly. We're not going to be talking about anything else. So once we have all that in place, then we see what projects we're up to. We see where that person fits in. Sometimes we don't have anything going on actively at the moment, but we know that we've got people on standby if we need them. So that's really the best way. One area we would like to explore a bit more is getting more of a depth in our social media presence. Because as you know, that like the information, it's constant. We could be posting hourly all these different situations of people being trafficked, people being arrested, story after story, but that's basically a full-time job. So that is one area I'm looking for. Another area I'm looking for are people that are just organized, who can help some of our back office stuff, like the administrative things. Those are kind of folks we're looking for. We're growing a bit more of our cybersecurity and our our online investigations, so to speak, or creating data. So we've got a really wide variety of needs. But that's basically just kind of short and sweet. They fill out the little form and we send them some info, and then they either raise their hand or they're like, it's not my interest. And that's okay too.
That sounds great. I imagine there'll be a lot of interest, especially after hearing the passion and the motivation that comes across from working with the ATII and the type of work that you do. Sam, thank you so much for taking the time. I know there's a lot to unpack over these questions, and I think the key takeaways for me is really the education piece and the intuition piece. And if you sense something's wrong, then follow through, take some action, report it in a SAR or an STR if you're up here in Canada, and make the most of being at home with COVID. If you have the time, explore volunteering. I know I'll be going on the ATI website looking for that teal button. But yeah, I just have to say thanks again, Sam. It's been really insightful going through this process.
You're welcome, and thank you for the opportunity. And